Good afternoon, all. Welcome to today's Connecting to Collections webinar on environmental controls. I am Priscilla Brendler, Executive Director for Greater Hudson Heritage Network, and I'd like to welcome you to the second of our series of Protecting Cultural Collections. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Greater Hudson Heritage Network is a cultural service organization formed to advance and advocate the preservation and interpretation of historical, ethnic too, and cultural heritages. We deliver resource assistance and professional workshop training for heritage keepers who collect, preserve, and interpret a diversity of uncommon community settings and collections. Greater Hudson also administers the Conservation Treatment Grant Program on behalf of NYSCA, which is New York State Council on the Arts, to support professional conservation treatment procedures to aid in the stabilization and preserving of New York's diverse cultural collections. Grants are awarded for prioritized, urgently need conservation of objects that, once treated, will impact public interpretive programs, exhibitions, and educations. The next grant deadline will be for June of 2014. We have more information on this grant can be found on the greaterhudson.org website. And just to keep in the back of your mind, the collections that are to be conserved can range from paintings, textiles. We had a mummified cat. We've received applications from a Native American Seneca rawhide outfit. There's a wide range of objects. So please do consider this with any objects you may have in your collections. Today's webinar is the part 2 on environmental monitoring and control. Today's webinar was specifically addressed developing an environmental monitoring program. But before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to pass it off to Carrie Sclafani, who is our program coordinator and technical producer for today's webinar, and she is going to walk you through any IT procedures and any troubleshooting you may have. Okay, Carrie?
Okay. Can you everyone hear me? Can we hear me? Okay, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. So a few notes to begin here. You may have noticed that you had two options for listening to the webinar, either through your computer speakers or by calling in. If you are calling in, you may have noticed you were supplied with an audio pin. You do not need to use this audio pin. Because of the number of attendees on today's webinar, we have muted you all. If you enter the pin and we have you muted, it will cause static on the webinar. Rest assured, you do not need the pin to hear the webinar. If you did enter the pin, please hang up and recall into the webinar without using the pin. If you are listening through your computer speakers and are having trouble with the sound, here are a couple of quick fixes you might try. First, close any other programs you might be running, but don't close out of the browser because you might log out of the webinar. Second, if you're hearing an echo, you may have mistakenly logged in twice. Third, if you're using a weak or a wireless network or a wireless device as a hotspot, you're going to have trouble with the sound. Worst case scenario, you can change from the voice over internet protocol option, which is listening through the computer, to listening through on the phone. Just click on the telephone option button on your attendee dashboard or dial in with the number provided and the webinar code, but not the audio pin. And you can resume listening. Be aware there's going to be a slight delay. At the bottom of your attendee dashboard is a box for you to ask questions. These can be technical questions from me, like what is the call-in number, or questions about the webinar material for Rachel to answer. Rest assured we can see all of the questions. You won't be able to see them, but we can see them. You're not just sort of sending them off into the void. We're going to be saving the questions to ask Rachel for the end of the program. So I think that's about it. I'm going to turn it back over to Priscilla now so she can tell you more about IMLS.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I appreciate that. All right, now that we have all the IT issues sorted out, we'd like to thank today's sponsor, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, for sponsoring today's program and for providing the funding for the Conservation and the Connecting Collections program. I want to thank them for their generosity, and we are able to bring you today's webinar thanks to all the participants of our 12 statewide partners. And if you're interested in learning more about the IMLS and their grant opportunities, you can visit them at www.imls.gov. We're going to move to the next slide. And what is the Connecting to Collections program? This is a partnership between Greater Hudson Heritage Network and other heritage organizations throughout New York State, which addresses specific preservation training needs and connections with collection types identified in a statewide survey as at risk in New York's planning project. Specifically, these were books and paper, which is no surprise to anybody, photographic collections, digital materials, and historic objects. Training is being provided via a 4-part webinar series. As you know, this is series number 2, and the second of it. Web-based how-to video tutorials providing instruction to organizational staff and volunteers and individuals who may have interest and need more information on their general collections, and a statewide interactive cross-disciplinary knowledge portal website that will serve as a clearinghouse for preservation practices and as a landing page for disaster preparedness plan. Finally, we also have a circuit rider mentoring program which is going to serve all of the corners of New York State for free site assessments. So in essence, this is an opportunity for your site to contact us, specifically me, to request a site visit. It could be on any issue of your collections. It could deal with disaster preparedness. It can deal with your environmental. You may have questions about your textiles, your paintings, your ethnographic objects. It could be your photographs, books and papers. You may be wondering about the proper storage environment. Whatever it may be, thanks to IMLS, we have the funding for a consultant to come out to your site for a half-day site visit to advise you and give you some ideas, suggestions, and we'll write up a 3-page report that is extremely useful when writing another grant or when sharing with your board. So please do not ever hesitate to give me a call if you have any questions about this, and this will be available for the next year. We have a couple of upcoming webinars. The next one is going to be on environmental monitoring and control, specifically on using the PEM2 software. This webinar was requested as one of the areas of weakness in regards to the statewide survey that was done on the areas of at risk. And that is because many museums, libraries, and archives have long been without adequate tools and procedures for addressing and managing collection storage and their display environments. This webinar series is going to introduce a concept of risk management for cultural collections and discuss important environmental factors that adversely affect our collections. The PEM2 monitors, which is an innovative tool for environmental monitoring and data analysis, is very sophisticated and frankly very expensive piece of equipment. But thanks to IMLS, we've been able to purchase the PEM2 monitors for these participants. And today's instructor will talk a little bit more about this a little bit later. Now, thanks to the wonder of technology, today's faculty instructor is joining us today from the Middle East. I'm so pleased to welcome our faculty instructor, Rachel Perkins Ehrenstein. She's joining us from Jerusalem, where she's currently curator of Bible Lands Museum. Rachel is a professional associate member of the American Institute for Conservation and has been a conservation or conservator partner in AM Art Conservation located in the Lower Hudson Valley. The firm provides conservation treatment services and preservation consulting with a focus on environmental monitoring and other preventative care services for clients of all types and sizes. She is the author of the National Park Service Consermograms on data loggers for monitoring the environment and has been a co-instructor at one-day workshops with the title Understanding Microclimates at the 2011 AIC meeting. Prior to entering private practice, she worked at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her degree in art conservation is from the University of London, and in addition to her conservation practice, she's active in several professional organizations, including positions as the e-editor for AIC and the co-chair for the Integrated Pest Management Working Group. So as you can see, she has a lot of background information on environmental controls, and frankly, she told me she likes to actually play with data loggers and other technology products. So she's the perfect person for today's program. Now, because she is joining us from long distance, we are hopeful that the technical issues will be minimal, but due to unforeseen events such as storms, solar flares, acts of God, acts of war, we're keeping an eye on the IT. If you have any problems, please send a little quick note to Carrie, who will be taking a look and will be able to work with you. So as we begin, we're going to put up a couple of poll questions on the screen that we'd like to share with you. There's going to be 3 in all. We'll give you a minute to record your answers, and then the data will be shared with Rachel, who will address the results at the end of the presentation. So Carrie's looking into putting up the first poll question. The first one is, are you currently monitoring your environment? It's very simple. You either are or you aren't. And if you don't know, if you are or you aren't, well, then you obviously don't know. So why don't you go ahead and just put in some of your results. Okay, we seem to have an almost even split. We have 47% said yes, they're monitoring, 47% said no, they are not monitoring, and a small group of 7% are not quite sure. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. The next poll question is, do you have a building management system? That is yes, no, or I don't know. Why don't you go ahead and let us know what you think about that one. Now this one is interesting. 46% they said yes, and yet it's changing a little bit now. Now it's 43% said they don't know. So 7% are not sure if they're monitoring their environment, and of course 47% say they don't know. So that means we really need to look into this a little bit more. And the final poll question coming up is, which of the following equipment are you using for monitoring? You're going to have to You can click on more than one. There's a hydrothermograph, the Arten hygrometer and humidity strip cards. Those are those little cards with all the little colored lines of pink going up to blue, etc. The standalone data loggers, hardwired or hot-wired logging system, or you're not sure. So click all of those that do apply. It looks like 31% are using the Arten system as well as the standalone data loggers. 31% are not sure if they're using anything. 23% are using the hydrothermographs, and 8% are actually hardwired into the logging system. Very wide group. All right, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. So right now we are going to turn the program over to Rachel, who will be able to present with today's program, and I will be back on a little bit later. Please stand by. Okay, Rachel?
Hello, everyone. Yep. Can everyone hear me? Or at least Priscilla or Carrie?
Yep, we read it loud and clear. I hope the weather's good in Jerusalem today. Or nice.
It's lovely. We're still walking around in short sleeves here, but let's see. We're going to let me. Just trying to get my screen up. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see the first screen on the presentation.
Yep, we're all set.
Terrific. Okay. So this is the second webinar in the Series 2 on environmental monitoring and control. In today's webinar, we're going to focus on how to set up an environmental monitoring program in your institution. We're going to talk about the who, what, where, when, and why. And I'm going to give you general guidelines based on best practices, but I recognize that there's a wide range of institutional types and sizes participating today, and not every aspect of this will be applicable to all of you. So for instance, when we talk about who should be on the preservation team, and you work in an institution with a staff of 2, obviously you're going to have to modify the concept. So while there are some basic principles here, there are a few hard and fast rules. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity at the end of the presentation when we have time for questions to ask if you're wondering how something should be applied to your circumstance. The other thing that I should say here is that this isn't rocket science, and although there's a lot that goes into it, this is something that nobody should be afraid to do. Okay. I know that Priscilla went through this very quickly, but I just wanted to put today's webinar in context again and review the 4 topics. So last month I gave a general overview of the topic of the collection environment. And we talked about the parameters that we're concerned with, temperature, relative humidity, and I introduced dew point as well. And we also discussed the kinds of deterioration that results from inappropriate environments. So we talked about mechanical damage, chemical decay and corrosion as the second kind, and biological attack. And I also introduced the idea that while the field of preservation has long promoted a general guideline, and please note that I'm not using the word standard, a general guideline of 70 degrees Fahrenheit plus or minus 2 degrees for temperature, and 50% plus or minus 5% for relative humidity, these conditions may not be appropriate or achievable for all institutions, depending on your building and your budget. And it also may not be appropriate or necessary depending on what you have in your collections. So again, I'm not saying these guidelines are wrong. They are general guidelines that have become accepted because they were sort of moderate and appropriate for a wide range of materials. And in the last webinar, I specifically avoided giving you a new set of numbers because what we really need to work towards is developing a more nuanced understanding of what your collection needs, what your building and systems can achieve, and work on, for instance, tempering the most inappropriate conditions or reducing the worst of your erratic fluctuations. So today we're going to talk in general about the practical aspects of monitoring. And my goal for this presentation is to give you an overview so that you know how to choose, place, and monitor equipment appropriate for your situation. Many of you are participating in the program to receive the PEM2 loggers, and Priscilla has ordered those, and they should be out to you in early to mid-November so that you have them by the time that we are ready for the 3rd webinar, which I believe is November 13th. So on that one, you'll see how easy it is to get the PEM2 set up and logging, and then we're going to focus on the specifics of the cloud-based software that accompanies it. In the final program, we're going to look at how the analysis of your data can help make decisions, help you in making decisions about what's best for your collection as well as for your budget. Okay. So last time we talked about what we mean when we talk about the museum environment. Now I want to talk about what it means to manage your environment. It depends on having knowledge of the conditions experienced by the collections. So you need your temperature and RH data in a form that can be effectively analyzed and used. Monitoring is essential if your institution is pursuing sustainable building operation. So by monitoring, we're documenting and recording the environmental conditions and hopefully developing a plan that reflects the goals that you want. And by managing, we're talking about proactively using that data and looking at it and making decisions based on that. Data gathering is not only important for learning what the collections are feeling. Logging data is also important to get to know your air handling systems, for those of you that have them, and what your spaces are doing in general, and so that you're able to identify problems and anticipate, identify problems as they're occurring, anticipate problems that might come during the sort of shoulder seasons, the spring and fall, where things tend to be a bit more variable, and allow you to make necessary adjustments. Again, we're looking at the environment because it not only has a huge effect on other parameters that that affect the overall preservation of our collections, but it also affects every aspect of our institutional life. It affects human comfort, it affects productivity, It affects our collection health. You know, the topic of environmental management has become increasingly popular especially even the largest institutions, the ones that we often think of as having the biggest budgets, because they're taking another look at their energy and capital costs. It affects the health of our building envelope, how well our building actually provides protection for the collections and for the inhabitants, as well as our overall budget. So the kinds of things that we can do with the data is, you know, sort of analyze it for overall preservation metrics, and we're going to discuss that more next time. We can measure our overall space conditions. We should be able to get a sense of our seasonal trends. We should be able to figure out how our building performs. You know, many buildings, I've worked in some, you know, really large institutions. When we talk about a place like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or Natural History, we're actually talking about one institution. Some of them have, you know, upwards of 17, 20 separate buildings within that, which are all sort of joined and cobbled together over time. So even if you're not, you know, the Met or Natural History, you may have a building which has had, you know, additions or other forms of construction. And so monitoring is going to allow you to figure out what's going on in those different spaces. Data should allow you to assess the performance of your air handling units. That's the AHU, air handling unit. And you should be able to sort of determine how well your equipment is being maintained and what kind of longevity to expect from it. Of course, it will diagnose malfunctions if you can't feel them already, and should allow you to make improvements or optimize your equipment. Doing all of this, though, requires a team approach. So, who is on the environmental management team? Managing the environment requires, in most cases, a team effort, since there are generally multiple stakeholders. The team needs to be cross-disciplinary. You need to have buy-in from your administration. And ultimately, we're looking, in this case, for facilities and preservation staff, or facilities and collection staff, to work together. Ultimately, the systems, you know, whether you have anything simple like air conditioning units or complicated like, you know, full, you know, building management systems, that's the purview of your facility team. But their goal should be to have an environment that's appropriate not just for the human inhabitants and visitors who come to your institution, but for the collections themselves. And that's where your expertise and opinions are necessary. And so really the two sides of you know, need to be working together, and communication and negotiation is going to be necessary. There's some cultural differences, though, that also need to be understood. I actually got into this aspect of preservation because I was in charge of doing the monitoring at a large institution. And when I would notice erratic areas in our time periods in our data, I would sort of trot off to the facility staff, and they would give me an answer that didn't really make sense with what I understood about the psychometrics and the science behind all of this. But I sort of felt like I was being given an answer, patted on the head, and told to go away with my little pieces of sort of girly equipment. And that prompted me to take a couple of HVAC engineering classes at New York City Technical College, because I felt like there was more information that I needed. Sorry, my daughter's having a bit of a bedtime tantrum in the background. So, so I think what I wanted to get across here is that, what I noticed was also in this large institution that there was a big problem between collections and our approach to what we wanted for the environment and what facility felt they were doing and how they needed to be spending their time. And if you have an actual environmental management team that gets together on a regular basis and that is sanctioned by your administration, that's going to go a long way towards getting this whole project started out on the right foot. Again, if you're in a really small institution, you have a different set of challenges because you're sort of maybe a one-man band. But we can come back to that later. Ultimately, the goal for the environmental management team is to negotiate the best trade-off between all factors. What is best for your collections, what is achievable in your climate and your buildings, what is acceptable for the occupants of the space, and what is the least energy consuming. For a while, one of the reasons I asked the question about the building management system was for a while there was a trend to try and get everybody to use the building management systems to monitor so that everybody was looking at the same data in the same way. And I'll discuss these kinds of systems in a little bit more detail shortly. But after sort of promoting that for a while, a number of us who were working in this field started to come back and re-examine that as a recommendation. And so we don't recommend that so much anymore. We do want now collections to do their own monitoring, and we want facilities to do their own monitoring. And you're both looking at slightly different data, and this is, again, one reason why you need to be working together, understanding what your equipment and what your monitoring data is showing and what their equipment and monitoring data is showing. So ultimately, though, since I'm talking to you and not to a group of facility managers, what we're expecting from collections and preservation staff is that you're going to be doing your own monitoring. You're going to make someone responsible both for collecting data and liaising with your facility staff. And in addition to just collecting the data, you're also going to be looking at your collections themselves and documenting the effect that that you're seeing within your collections. Okay, so what are we monitoring? There are other parameters that can be measured and might factor into decision making on the environment, but mostly what we're going to be talking about again in this series is temperature and relative humidity. There are other loggers that look at light intensity or accumulation. You can also track activity in a space, opening and closing of doors, and other variables. And many of these things also relate to our temperature and relative humidity. So if anybody has questions on how to measure some of the other things to help you make sense of your data, we can discuss that at the end. But again, the kinds of things that those of you on the environmental management team need to understand are how your collections are affected by the environment, the relationship between temperature and relative humidity and dew point, and if anyone's still confused about that, after last month's webinar, we can discuss that in the question and answer period. Some of the things that are useful for our side to know, and I felt much more in control once I had a sense of some of the HVAC fundamentals. HVAC, HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And we also need to, on our end, bulk up a little bit on our understanding about how our buildings are constructed and how they use energy. And so that's some of the stuff that makes us better partners when we present our temperature and relative humidity data to facility staff and want to sit down and discuss what's going on. So one of the things that we should be monitoring, in addition to the stuff going on inside that we're going to spend most of our time discussing, is also what's going on outside. We want to understand the general trends, the outdoor variations, because they influence, obviously, our indoor variations. Generally, most buildings, you will be able to see a seasonal sort of drift, and so rather than expecting that buildings will keep sort of a flat line throughout the year, we want to be able to set appropriate seasonal targets. We want the outdoor data so we can compare it with the indoor data, and that's going to allow us to understand our building envelope and the performance of our HVAC systems. One of the things that's really great about the eClimate Notebook software is that it's going to allow you to easily download exterior data from nearby weather stations. And so you don't, in this particular case, you won't need to purchase an additional piece of equipment to be able to access this data. For some of you, you're going to be, a lot of these weather stations are in airports, so some of you are going to have access to data that's probably very close by, and others of you, who are maybe farther away from even a small airport, may have data that's not exactly representative of what's going on in your particular location, but should be approximate and will still allow you to make sort of general trend analysis. Okay, but what we're mostly interested in monitoring is the conditions in your collections. So in order to know that, we're going to need to start to get a sense of which materials are in which locations. Again, the condition and vulnerability of your collections, and the use and access of these collections. So this is going to help you when you start to figure out where to monitor. And we're going to come back to that a little bit after we discuss equipment. Okay, so given the poll results, it seems like half of you are monitoring, and a good bit of you are monitoring using fairly sophisticated pieces of equipment. And while you're going to be receiving a PEM2 monitor, ultimately one monitor is really not enough for you to get a sense of what's going on in your building. It's a great start, and hopefully it's going to allow you to get some data and start this process. But for those of you who are in sort of moderate or larger size buildings, it's not going to really be sufficient. So I think of this as sort of a starter course. And because of that, I wanted to give you a sense of sort of the fuller range of options, so that if you decide that you want to purchase other bits of equipment, that there may be some other things that you want to consider based on your needs. So these are the different kinds of things. There are hygrometers, hygrothermographs, the building management systems, electronic data loggers, and real-time monitoring systems. So let's discuss the pros and cons of these different things. Okay. Hygrometers are devices that measure humidity, and thermohygrometers will measure temperature and relative humidity. They're low-tech options, but they still have a place for certain applications. There are analog versions, like this dial type, seen in the top right corner, or digital versions like the ones shown in the middle. The example on the bottom is called the R10, and you see that it has a dial for humidity, a dial for temperature, and then one of those humidity strips that Priscilla mentioned sort of range from pink to blue at the bottom, and that's designed to sort of be a redundant check on the humidity so that you know when they need to be recalibrated. These units, all of these kinds of units, whether they're analog or digital, tend to be cheap, and they also tend to be of variable accuracy. The analog version, the dial and the Arkin units, can usually be calibrated by yourself if you have a reasonable standard to calibrate them against. This kind of unit is only going to provide you with a spot check, meaning that they don't record and they don't log anything. And so in order to get data from them, you'd have to be sort of checking and recording them, but you're only going to be recording, you're only going to be getting data for that one point in time during your 24-hour day. And so you're not going to know what's going on if you're not actually standing right there and looking at it. The exception to that is that some of the digital versions do record like a high and low reading. So you could sort of get a sense of your outliers. These units do have a sort of ongoing use, though. They're particularly useful for applications like putting them in a buffered vitrine, like one with silica gel, for instance, so that you know when it's time to recondition your gel. And that's sort of my favorite use for these kinds of things. Okay. A step up from the hygrometer is the hygrothermograph, which I assume most of you are familiar with. We've been seeing these for decades. Why can't I continue to use my hygrothermograph is something I used to hear from people a lot. And the short answer is that you can. Hygrothermographs remain available, and providing that they're properly cared for, they can provide you with years of yeoman service with relatively little effort. They do need to be calibrated regularly, meaning weekly or monthly, depending on when you change the paper charts. Because the horsehair, that is the measurement for the relative humidity, moves out of calibration relatively quickly. The unit that you're seeing down below is called an aspirating psychrometer. And this is the best piece of equipment to recalibrate your hygrothermograph on a regular basis. As everyone has moved towards data loggers, though, it's getting harder to find the paper charts and pens to use with the hygrothermographs. And so they are slowly sort of falling by the wayside. The main reason, though, is that it precludes the use of data in computational tools. You can't really easily analyze your data statistically to get a sense of the big picture and compare things. So we talked about the hygrometers, we talked about the hygrothermographs, and now I'm going to jump to the other end of the technological spectrum, where we have the building management systems, or BMSs. BMSs are computer-based control systems installed in buildings, and they control and monitor the building's mechanical and electrical equipment, such as ventilation, lighting, power, fire, and security systems. Building management systems are most common to larger buildings, and the systems linked to a BMS typically represent 40% of a building's energy usage. And if we include lighting, the number approaches 70%. They're a critical component to managing our energy demand, not just within our building, but BMSs, in the research I was doing, approximately account for approximately 8% of total energy usage in the United States. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a screenshot of one type of BMS view, showing what's going on in part of an HVAC system. So you can see that it's monitoring within the valves, what's going on in your space, what's coming in from your outdoor supply. It's giving your facility staff a lot of information, so hopefully they can diagnose what's going on in the system. Some BMS is data, and so for certain kinds of problems, it may be appropriate to do that. But it takes a lot of memory from the system and it slows it down, so facility staff don't tend to like to do it for very long or on too many points. they can sort of always go in and get a real-time check, but the logging bit to provide sort of a history or a trend is what seems to slow the system down. The other thing to understand about building management systems and how they monitor is that the sensors are really designed to allow it to monitor itself and its own performance. And so what we want to do with our monitoring in collections is to have like an independent check, one that we can control where the data is being collected. So if you're a collection manager, curator, or registrar, ultimately your job isn't to run the BMS. Your job is to work with the facility staff who run the system to ensure that it's performing to meet the demands of your collection. So that's why rather than having everybody monitor on the BMS and sort of share that data, we recommend that we do our own monitoring. But it is important to know if you have one of these systems in place that you can get a lot of information, and that sometimes this information may need to be shared to be able to figure out what's going on in the system and why whether it can or why it isn't performing in ways that are appropriate. Okay. So just to reiterate, the reasons why why we're not going to use a building management system for our long-term preservation monitoring needs is that the BMS is really separate and it's a proprietary software generally, and if it's linked to your other systems, it just needs to be secure. It's about controlling the equipment that's linked to it, not so much about analysis, and so it isn't really designed for you to be able to take a look at the data in a way that we want to, and that's the same for where the sensors are placed. They're going to be placed in the ducts or on the walls, or not within our collection spaces in the places that we will want to have our data. And doing a trend or running what they call a trend, meaning logging data off the BMS, takes a lot of facility staff time, and they probably have other things going on. But it's just good to know that it is an option for the times when it's necessary. So what we're really going to focus on for most of this is what I call the standalone data logger. So that's sort of our monitor of choice these days. A data logger is a general name for a battery-powered device with a sensor and a microprocessor that's going to record information. And again, for our purposes, we're going to talk about temperature and RH, but some of these kinds of loggers will measure all sorts of these other parameters: light, occupancy, open, close, on and off. Okay. And so when I talk about data loggers, I'm also going to be referring to these standalone units rather than wireless real-time systems that we'll get to in a minute. Just to sort of show you quickly the images I have here. On the right, this is what's called the Onset Hobo. This is their U series, which has been phased out or is being phased out now. Many of you probably still have some of these. And to the left is the new UX series. In the middle here is called the Veritech logger. It's generally higher priced than the Onset, but has a good quality sensor. And down below is a picture of the PEM2, which many of you will be receiving as part of this program. Okay. In the 13 years since I wrote the first National Park Service Conservagram on evaluating data loggers for museum monitoring, there's been an explosion of new devices. Many of them are appropriate and accurate enough for most museum needs, but there are differences in the products and the way the manufacturers describe them, and people often find the choices overwhelming. And this leads to one of my personal pet peeves. People will write into the various preservation listservs with a query like, I need to monitor my environment. What are things that people are using that they're happy with? And of course, colleagues will write back with answers like, we love the PEM2, or we have used hobos with no trouble. But this isn't the best way to ask or answer the question, because there's real differences in these products, and the real trick is in matching your needs with the right product. So anyone who writes in, I need to monitor what should, what are people using, without giving information on how many spaces do you need to monitor, what is your budget, what is your level of technological savvy, what else besides temperature and RH might you need to monitor, is not really giving someone enough information to provide you good advice. So, so that was what led to this conservagram. The updated version of the conservagram lays out the various parameters of data logger hardware and software, and it lists questions that you should ask yourself in trying to determine your needs. And then there are these tables that give information on the products that we examined. And if you have specific questions, you're welcome to ask that at the end, or email me after the presentation. And I can give you sort of my own personal experience with those. And you can find the conservagram online now that our government is back up and running. The most important thing to remember about data loggers is that they can range in price from $68 to, I think the highest price one we evaluated was $740. That's down from $1,000 about a decade ago. And there's real reasons why the loggers are priced the way they are. So you shouldn't expect an inexpensive product to perform the same as a high-end product. That said, there are uses for both ends of the spectrum. And it's okay if your budget is limited, or if you are putting them in packing crates, you don't want to put an $800 piece of equipment. So it's really about matching your product and your project. But then again, you don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish. The PEM2 is now considered, I would consider a sort of a moderate price, but when you think about the software or the time involved, or in fact the time not involved in setting them up because they're so easy to install, that's time and money saved in certain other ways. So, and in terms of the ancillary costs, that's other things like software, cables, IT support, and your own sanity. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this since it's mostly listed in the conservagram, and you can also listen to the Connecting to Collections online webinar that really focused on that conservagram and sort of explaining it step by step. So, but again, the reason why some loggers are priced at $60, $70 and some are closer to $800 is going to depend on how many of these features they have. And so, again, having a sense of what you want to monitor and where and is going to be important. In addition to the hardware, you also have your data and graphing considerations. So, how do you download? Do you need to have a laptop that you can bring to your logger? Can you use a flash drive like we'll be able to use with the PEMs? Some loggers have an available handheld unit. Of course, the next big thing is surely that it's going to download onto our phones. You have to sort of think about what your format for data and graphs are, and are you comfortable with Excel or not so much, and considerations like that. Okay, for those of you who want to get fancy, though, let's talk for a couple minutes about wireless monitoring. With data loggers, each logger works independently, and you have to download the data to view the results. Wireless loggers are actually a bit of a misnomer. More appropriate would be wireless monitoring systems because for the most part, wireless sensors aren't logging and storing the information. They're relaying it to a collection point, and whether that's the nearest Ethernet connection or back to a PC in your office or lab. So what you're seeing here in this picture for the EZ-Log unit is that there's these EZ-Logs set up in various places around this office, and they're all beaming the signal wirelessly back to the base unit, which is set up in this office on the PC. This section of the market is really changing rapidly with a lot of new products being introduced every year. And there's several different ways that systems provide real-time data. There's the radio frequency systems, and this image here down below is an image from the Hanwell system, where you have the radio logger transmitter set up in various spaces. The data is collected by the radio receiver and then transferred, in this case, to the local server, where it's then immediately available for you on your computer. You can use some of the standalone loggers and actually hardwire them into your Ethernet. There's a few units now that work over the cell phone networks, and then the newest ones work with Wi-Fi. So an example of those would be the T&D products, and the newest, which came out about this time last year, was the Lascar Wi-Fi units. The key to having a successful wireless monitoring system is testing the units in your building.
So just quickly to make sure that it didn't get garbled, the reasons for using a wireless system is whether if you need real-time data, if you have the ability to actually change and control your environment, that means you have a full HVAC system or you have a BMS, and so having real-time data allows you to actually make changes and corrections quickly. If you don't, the other reasons would be if you have off-site locations that you aren't working in and you want to sort of keep an eye on that when you're not there. If you have lots of data, so by lots of data I mean probably monitoring more than 20 locations within your institution. If you're locating that many data points, if you're monitoring that many data points, it can get onerous to sort of go around and collect and download on a regular basis. And so that would be a reason to go to wireless monitoring. And if you have enclosed spaces. So one of the compelling reasons can be to monitor sealed microclimates. And a microclimate, by microclimate I mean sort of any environment that's smaller than your general space. So something like a closed cabinet or most commonly a closed vitrine. And so we can come back to this question about using silica gel or a desiccant which would create a microclimate in a case. So to give you an example, when I was at the American Museum of Natural History, one of the cases I had to monitor was that of what was called Copperman, which was an ancient Peruvian miner who had gotten trapped in the mine, and his body had been completely replaced by minerals. So it was basically a copper mineral mummy. And he was stored in or exhibited in a very well sealed case with silica gel to keep the relative humidity down as low as possible. And a single wireless monitor would have been a great way to know when we had to open the case to recondition the gel. On a larger scale, you could have a special exhibit where the lender requests specific conditions and requires the case to be sealed after the courier leaves. And wireless transmission of data from that case would allow you to monitor the microclimate without having to receive permission from the lender or having to open the case. So those are reasons why people are really excited about wireless monitoring. But again, this you have to decide whether this is the right kind of product for you. The questions to ask yourself if you're ready for wireless is, do you have the budget? Do you have a network already in your institution? And do you have an IT person or department? Are you technologically savvy? And you know, if your IT department is on board, is it going to work well with their systems? You have to, you know, be able to work with firewalls or through them or not. So if you purchase a wireless system now, you're essentially purchasing a system that's a step up from standalone data loggers. Just know that, like with any other technology, the field is moving quickly and these systems are going to be different or obsolete in just a couple of years. The other thing to know is that wireless doesn't necessarily mean that that your data uploads to the cloud, as we say. Most of these systems are working off your internal network, and the transmission is wireless, but it's transmitting back to a sole point, and then in some cases you can choose to make it web accessible. So this is important to understand when you consider who needs to see your data. So for instance, the PEM2 is a standalone data logger, and you're going to be uploading your data to a cloud-based system. So there's no software that sits on your personal PC. It's stored out there in the ether online. And that enables you and anyone else in your institution to be able to have access to your data. Cloud systems for storing data exist, but they're not really sort of plug-and-play packaged in a way that most small to medium-sized museum clients really want or need at this point. So if you're trying to construct your own custom system with cloud storage, you just need to make sure that you're aware of reoccurring or hidden costs for data storage, which can quickly add up over time. Okay. So we just went over a bunch of different kinds of hardware, ranging from the really simple to the much more complex. And choosing what kind of equipment you need is going to come down to what questions you're trying to answer. Does wireless monitoring help you, or does it just, does it make your life easier? The goal here is to spend more time analyzing your data than collecting it. So, we have to sort of remember why we're monitoring. Environmental monitoring is now considered part of good collection care, but you don't get to put in the system and then check off the box on your to-do list. Monitoring your environment is just the first step, and you need to be asking these questions using your data to answer them. What conditions are my collections subjected to? How can I mitigate the worst conditions? Is my HVAC system functioning? Where might I find some energy and cost savings? If having a wireless system won't enhance your ability to collect the data and answer your questions, you might want to reassess. The other thing to keep in mind about monitoring is that nobody likes to go around and collect data from their loggers, but doing the rounds, so to speak, can actually serve an important function as it gets you into your spaces and looking at your collection. So you shouldn't consider it just busy work. What I hope you guys took away from the last webinar, and you'll gain from this one as well, is understanding that what works for your friends on the registrar's, the RCAAM list, isn't what will necessarily work for you. And so the goal of all of this is to think about your project and assess whether which of these given products is going to meet your needs. In next month's webinar, I'm going to discuss a lot more about IPI's PEM2, but here are just a couple of the quick reasons why we chose this for this grant project. The PEM2 has you download your data onto one of these little flash drives, and this is the one thing that your institution is going to be required to purchase to be able to participate in this project. You'll just need to have your own flash drive. It doesn't need to be a big one. You can buy them all over the place. The data files that you're going to be downloading don't take up a lot of room. The one thing that we strongly recommend is that you have one flash drive that's dedicated to use with the PEM and for your environmental monitoring. The PEM2 is generally a well-calibrated and accurate monitor. It has a long battery life, and it's good for sort of long-term general trend monitoring. The software, if you're all going to be participating on the Greater Hudson Heritage Network's a software account, but if you choose to have additional loggers that you purchase on your own, there's a tiered structure for the pricing of their cloud-based software. And ultimately, this is really the only logger that's been developed purposely for use by museums and cultural institutions and archives and libraries. The Image Permanence Institute that has developed it really has focused on developing preservation metrics, and we're going to discuss those next month. And we discussed that it has they calibrate it to a high degree. Okay. How many loggers do you need? You're going to be getting one as part of this program, but as I mentioned earlier, one really isn't enough. And so the guidelines would be one sort of per space. So a space could be a storage room or a gallery. So you have to sort of count up how many spaces do you have where collections are being stored or exhibited. You want to be monitoring where you have spaces that have preservation concerns, where you keep your collections of greatest significance. If you have any microclimates, smaller spaces, cabinets or vitrines that you want to monitor what's going on inside them. If you have a larger building and you have multiple air handlers, you would want to have a monitor in each of those. And if you have existing spaces or building issues, you need to have coverage to be able to sort of distinguish between those different spaces. So you'll probably, ultimately, one is a good start, but you'll probably need more than one if you really want to get a sense of what's going on in your building. And the next thing is logger location. Just like there's no magical number of monitors or locations, there's no magical rule for placement. You want to place your logger to provide the information that is going to give you what you need to know. So wherever there's reason to believe that conditions may differ, and you want your data to be representative of the space. So you can put it within or near a particularly significant collection that will allow you to diagnose or confirm poor conditions. For placement, again, no firm rules, but you generally want to be placing your logger amidst the collections or in your display at sort of a moderate height. So we're talking about 4 to 6 feet up from the floor. You don't need to be measuring up sort of near your ceiling unless you want to be able to see what's going on with collections that are also stored up near the ceiling. In order to make your life easier, you want it to be accessible for downloading, and you want it to be away from the HVAC supply ducts. So the goal for our monitoring and data is to be able to see what is going on within the collection spaces, not what our building management system would be telling us that's sort of coming out of our system. When we do our final webinar, we're only going to have a little bit of data in the system, but you're going to have the PEM2 for a year. Ultimately, until you have a year's worth of data, it's hard to make any real judgments. So if any of you have gone through a CAP report and a collections assessment program, and you haven't been monitoring, your assessor may have said, buy some environmental monitoring equipment, set it up, monitor for a year, and then you'll be able to start to figure out what your needs are. The full year's worth of monitoring is going to allow you to understand what your sort of longer-term trends are, which is equally as important as or actually more important than your sort of daily issues. Remember last month we talked about that objects respond to temperature quickly, but actually RH sort of it takes longer, days or even weeks. So understanding what your winter dryness levels are or your summer heat or humidity is going to be the kind of important data that you get out of longer periods of monitoring. Okay. What do we do with our data once we have it? I generally recommend that people download their data monthly. That means that if a sensor malfunctions, you don't lose too much data by sort of not knowing that a problem occurred. If you have if you're monitoring just for some general trends, you can maybe do it seasonally, every quarter. But you'll also want to check your data if there are any anomalies or emergencies. Something like Hurricane Sandy a year ago provided a lot of really interesting data for institutions to see how their systems performed or didn't perform when they were shut down with a weather emergency. The other thing that's really important with the PEM2, your data is uploaded to the cloud. It's continuously backed up and it's safe. But if you're using a standalone data logger or a wireless system that's going to a PC or network, please make sure that you back that data up regularly and that you don't lose it. You should be considering this as an important part of your archive. So next month we're going to spend a lot more time looking at how we analyze our data. But the kinds of things that we're going to want to be looking at is the influence of outside conditions. That's where that external data comes from. What happens during the seasonal changes? What are our levels of extremes? And if you can start to get a sense of how occupancy affects your data and how the various equipment that you're using in your building affects your conditions. And the other thing I like to recommend that clients do is that they keep a log whether, when things happen that are anomalies, whether they're intentional or accidental. If your system breaks down, if there's a hurricane, all those things are useful to keep in just even a Word document or a spreadsheet. Next month we're going to take a look at the preservation metrics that the Image Permanence Institute has put into their software. But the idea of that is for people who are not familiar or comfortable with crunching the raw numbers, like you see here, this risk summary, the goal is to give you sort of an easier way to make sense of your data. This is another view that compares 3 different spaces here, and you can see the one on top, the 00630, is probably the space with the best environment, whereas the middle one and the bottom one have some issues. And so that may allow the preservation staff to sort of think about what's being stored where. Okay. What I want you to take home today after our technical troubles and all of this information being thrown at you, and again, you will get the transcript with with the slides and all the notes, so you can go back through this at your own pace, is that the logger selection and placement depends on your preservation management goals. That data needs to be organized and accessible to be useful, that the software, which is a big part of how you you look at your data is critical, and that plays a big part in how you make hardware choices, and making sure that you always have a backup for your important data. If you're spending all this money to collect it and time to download it and analyze it, you don't want to lose it because your hard drive goes out. Again, taking the long-term view that that it's not about putting the data logger in your space and walking away and saying, now I'm done with that. It's going to be about collecting your data, analyzing what's going on, documenting the conditions in your spaces, working with other staff in your environment to plan and make revisions, and repeating that cycle on a regular basis. Again, I'd like to thank the Image Permanence Institute that provided images for the slides. Some of the PowerPoint information came from their Sustainable Preservation Environment series. And I'd like to thank Priscilla and Carrie for keeping us moving forward, even with the vagaries of the Internet. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, hopefully, Carrie and Priscilla, for some questions.
Yes, we do have a few for you. Okay, the first one was from an organization that has a small historical society. And after listening to this, they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So based on this, what could you advise them? In other words, what would you say to them? Is this biting off more than they can chew? Can small organizations also be able to manage this sort of environmental monitoring for a year? I mean, what would you say to someone like that?
Right. So, what I want them to walk away from is to not be freaked out by this. That if they're participating in the program where they're going to get one of the PEM2s, let's start with that. Let's monitor, one space so that they can see how easy it can be with the right equipment, and we'll get them up and running with the PEM2, which really could not be simpler to work. And software, there's all sorts of software that can do amazing things, but even if you just know how to do the basic stuff, that might be enough for you. If you're in a small institution with, a few rooms, start with, one and add on from there.
Okay, that sounds good. The next one asks, what sort of network do you need to run wireless monitors?
So again, that's it depends. It depends on the different kind of wireless systems. So, for instance, this LASCAR, it's called the EL Wi-Fi system, that will run off of like a simple router, like the kind that you may have in your own home, to have wireless in your own home. Other systems require a little bit more, a more technologically robust network. The problem that we get into is that for larger institutions, they may have firewalls or other things that protect, let's say, your collection management system. So that's where, if you're in a sort of medium to mid-sized institution, you're not going to be able to go the wireless route without working with your IT department. So again, I should refer people, if you really are interested in wireless, to access the Connecting to Collections online community webinar. And again, the link, the direct link to that will come with the notes for this webinar. You can also Google it, and that's really available, and that goes much more into depth about the wireless options.
And just to let you know, we also have a hot link on the c2cnys.org site, which takes everyone to the main Connecting to Collections, which is nationwide. So they can access it that way, Rachel, as well, which is handy. All right, we have another question for you, Rachel. It says, quote,
Okay.
in a nutshell, what would I say to our head of facilities so that he would understand why I don't think his BMS is enough to monitor my collections? For example, storage areas. For example, storage areas.
Okay, that's a good question. So what you want to ask him is, see if he can give you a tour of his system. A lot of the facility guys are really, proud of their system. They're proud of the work and training that they need to manage these sophisticated systems. And so there's nothing wrong with, going in and asking some, innocent questions. So you might want to ask him, because let's face it, most facility staff are male, and in fact, a lot of preservation or collection staff is female, and this is part of understanding this sort of cultural difference. Again, this is sort of a gross generalization, but understanding sort of where collections and preservation skills and knowledge lie versus facility skills and knowledge, and how we communicate with each other is an important part of this equation. So you might want to ask him sort of where are his sensors. So he may show you, his sensor, and it may be either inside the duct or, right at the sort of on the wall, right, sort of underneath where the air supply comes in. Sometimes it's next to the door. And you can say, well, that's interesting because that probably provides you with the information that you need on, the air supply coming into the room. But what I'm really interested in knowing is what is the environment by the time it gets all the way over here where our Gutenberg Bible or our Mona Lisa or our, ethnographic hide shirts or, whatever your prime collection is. And maybe that's not located so close to where his sensor is. So he's going to be getting one kind of data, and you're sort of interested in the end, the end result. And so, you need to work together to sort of figure out if the air coming in is coming in, the way it should be, but your environment in the other side of the room where the collections are isn't what you're happy with, then that's what you guys need to sit down and discuss. The other thing to ask about is when their equipment was last calibrated. This sometimes becomes a sore point, and they'll say, oh, it doesn't need to be calibrated, it's digital. So that's true for the temperature, but it's not true of relative humidity. Even digital relative humidity sensors do need calibration. And so if their system has been in place for a number of years and your data is not jiving with theirs, that's another thing to check.
Interesting. Okay. One other question that came through is that can desiccants be put into showcases? One of our display cases is in a library and seems to hold dampness because of a change in the heat and cold from a doorway entrance. So this is getting very specific. What do you think about that one?
Well, yes. So if you have an overall environment that isn't suitable for your needs, a microclimate, a smaller sealed environment that you can control with the use of, in this case, they're asking about a desiccant, but something like silica gel, which can either be a desiccant to dry out the environment, or it can be conditioned to whatever environment you want it to be. So silica gel, you can get it sort of what we call dry, which is meaning that it's really designed to pull to dry out the environment, or you can get it, say, conditioned to 45, in which case it's going to sort of absorb and give off moisture depending on the fluctuations. So yes, that's an excellent thing to do. The one thing you need to understand is your ability to maintain conditions within a microclimate is going to depend on how well sealed that case, that vitrine or cabinet or whatever it is. And the best way to monitor that would be through using something either low-tech like those Arten thermohygrometers, or high-tech like a standalone logger with a probe that feeds in, or a wireless logger. But you need to know that to know what your silica gel is doing inside that case.
Okay, building on that, I got one question. Yep. Building on it, someone asked, what about the little packages of silica gel that you get in, let's say you're buying a new iPad and you get these little silica gels. Can those be repurposed and used, or do they really need to go to a more of a supply place such as Gaylord to get the...
That's a good question. So if you buy like a pair of shoes and it comes with, a little packet inside that, it's like, that says silica gel, do not eat.
Yes, that's it.
That is silica gel. But that is not going to be enough. You would have to go on like a complete shoe buying spree to accumulate enough of those little packets to make a difference. Any kind of silica gel that you buy, whether it's the ArtZorb, ProZorb, Rapid Gel, the different suppliers that the different kinds of gel that the preservation suppliers supply. Each of those has a different formula for calculating how much gel you need to provide adequate buffering in an environment of a particular size. So sometimes they have like a little online calculator right there, and you should be able to plug in the dimensions of your vitrine, and it will tell you how much silica gel you need to buy. So the short answer is that what you get in those little packets is silica gel. It tends to be a different formulation than what preservation suppliers sell, which is generally a high-performance gel. You need less of it to provide buffering. And so I would say no. Don't buy more shoes in the hopes of also killing two birds with one stone. Go to the preservation suppliers.
Also, there's the issue that perhaps the paper is not stable, could off-gas, the ones that you're getting in your shoes. Generally, it's not going to be in direct contact. It's possible, but I'd say the greater concern is that you're just not going to have enough of it or the right kind of it. Good. Okay. Here's another one for you, Rachel. I have 2 collection spaces to monitor. The first has its own environmental monitoring system and is in a small space. The other is a large space, it's a warehouse, which does not have humidity controls. I'd like to monitor this space, but I'm concerned about placement. That is a comment from them.
So, I'd encourage whoever sent that in to contact me offline, and we can sort of maybe discuss more of the specifics of their space to know how many square feet are we talking about, how high are the ceilings, where are collections placed within that. I think one thing that if you have the budget, having more than one monitor in a large space is really great. After a year, generally you can look at your data and say, you know what, the data isn't all that different. Maybe it's a little bit hotter and drier on this side and our south-facing side or something like that. Or after a year, you may look at it and say, wow, we've got sort of 2 different environments going on in this big space. So if your budget allows, more monitoring points will give you more information. Whether you'll need to maintain that over time, only after you have sort of a year's worth of data will you really know. But I'm happy to discuss the specifics if they want to contact me after.
Okay, I think that was our last question for you right now, Rachel. So just to inform everyone that on Friday they will receive a web link to the entire recorded webinar that Rachel just gave, as well as a copy of the transcript and Rachel's PowerPoint. And This is fantastic because you can go back, take a look at it anytime you want, as frequently as you want, so you do not have to worry about that link getting old and not being able to use it again. In the same email, there will also be a survey. We hope that you'll take just a couple of minutes to fill it out. The questions in there will help Rachel be able to add other information, content, questions you may have regarding the PEM2s to the next webinar, and we'll be able to provide some content for some of the other future webinars in general as far as accessibility. And then also, looks like we have one more thing. Oh, we have another question. Okay, where can a standardized log be found to record raw data?
To record raw data, do you, I guess, does the questioner mean if they have something like the hygrometers, which is a spot check? You know, is that what they're asking?
I don't know. If this is your question, if you could just let us know. I think what could also work is people can email you directly. Is that right? Because I see that
Absolutely.
We do provide. Okay.
Yep.
So if some of these questions, like the warehouse one, maybe this one about the standardized log, can be emailed directly to Rachel, and she'll be able to address it. I think that would be very helpful for actually getting a little bit more information.
Anything out of that comes out, you know, that will be of use to the greater audience, I can quickly introduce that at the beginning of next webinar. I realize that, you know, this really was a lot of information packed in very quickly, and what I tried to do is just sort of breeze through the areas where there are other resources for you to go back and access if you want more information on that type. But the goal here was really to get you to understand that there are lots of different options, and again, what you need to do is to think about, you know, your space, your collections, your team, and, you know, what is it you want to know? And, you know, is one data point going to be enough for you to, you know, to start out? You know, are you ready for more, and to understand, you know, that there's a lot of adequate equipment choices out there, and for you to understand sort of how to access the other information that allows you to make decisions about choosing that.
Great. Okay. So I think we've pretty much covered the information for this webinar. Just to remind everyone that the next webinar will be held on Monday, November 13th at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Rachel will discuss using the PEM2 monitors and its software. The webinar will train attendees on the use of the PEM2s and associated software for monitoring the environment in their institutions. The webinar will cover setting it up, troubleshooting the software and hardware, downloading the data, and viewing and analyzing the information. If at any time, as we mentioned, you have any questions about the material that was covered today, the last webinar, you can contact Greater Hudson. You can also email Rachel directly. You see her email that is listed there. Because frankly, if you have a question, I bet others do too. And this is going to be, oh, I said Monday, pardon me, it's a Wednesday, November 13th. So just make sure that you have that right, because I had it wrong. Next, we just want to say that today concludes today's webinar. Right now, I'd like to thank Rachel so much for being our instructor and for all your perseverance in dealing with the long-distance issues and with the audio. So thank you, Rachel, so much for that. And also for Carrie, who was frantically working on the computer to try to troubleshoot some of the issues on this end. And also to IMLS for making today's webinar possible. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on November 13th. Take care, everyone, and take care, Rachel. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.